And welcome to An Educator's Plan to Thrive, a time to reflect, recharge, and reconnect. You know, as the school year comes to an end, it's essential to reflect on our sense of connection and how it impacts our well-being both in and out of the classroom. Gaggle's mission has always been ensuring the safety and well-being of students within K-12 school districts. And what better way to kick off the summer than to help those adults closest to students refill their own cups. I'm Jody Lott, the Director of Sales here at Gaggle, and I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's conversation. First up is Jojo McKecken, Kai Tayu, the founder of the Learner First, As a celebrated author, speaker, change leader, and executive coach, Jojo's 35 years of experience span time as a teacher, principal, Ministry of Education system leader in New Zealand, and now a globally recognized pioneer in the fields of education design, assessment, and well-being. We also have Beth Hamilton, and she is the U.S. Executive Director of the Learner First. Beth is a dynamic, energetic, student-centered leader with 20 years in the field of education. She currently manages an expert team of consultants at the Learner First and delivers professional learning within districts and schools. Beth has a proven record of building and leading effective teams that deliver highly impactful solutions for improving students' academic, social, and emotional outcomes. Pardon me, that was a bit of a mouthful. And then here to bring her clinical perspective, Dr. Lisa Stroman, a psychologist, attorney, author, and mother. Dr. Stroman established Digital Citizen Academy to help keep families safe from online dangers. Her background working as a visiting scholar with the profiling unit at the FBI during one of the most tragic school shootings in the United States helped create her passion for proactively preventing and educating students, educators, and parents on issues related to technology. So welcome everyone. Thank you each for taking time to be here today with us. First up, we have Jojo McKecken. So I will turn things over to you to go ahead and get things started.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Joanne McKecken tuku ingoa, ko nai tahu te iwi. I've just introduced myself as Joanne McKecken, and I've introduced myself in my native language, which is Maori. I'm from New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's a very long way away, but today I'm sitting in Mexico, which is a lot closer to probably where most of you are sitting. And on the screen today, we have a beautiful long word for you, and that is in my native language, in Maori, and it's waka whanaungatanga. And I was laughing with the Gaggle team before when we were talking about what does that word mean. That word is a beautiful word, and it's a long word, and I'll tell you the actual translation of it as we go through the session today. But really what it's about is the word means it's about processing and establishing relationships with others, the ways in which people come into a relationship with the world, with people, and with life. And I really want to start off today by just saying it's a real honor and a privilege to be here today with my team member, Beth, and just to say to you that instead of us starting off by talking about the business of what we're talking about, I want to start by establishing a way of being with you, a way of thinking about connecting with you in a way that's not about the business, but it's about us as people and who are we. So what I wanted to do was introduce myself to you in my way. And when we meet people, we often go straight to who are you and what do you do? So I wanted today to start with who are we as a person and who are we as a connection. So we start to think differently about when we connect with each other, what do we really want to connect about? I want to honor the fact that you are educators. I want to honor the fact that you are spending your time and your lives giving to young people. And I want to challenge you today to really think about how can you connect with you yourself? How can you connect with you, your families? How can you connect with you in your circle of people? Interestingly enough, when I first came across back over to the United States, I was reading the Surgeon General's comments about social connection and the importance of that, the connection between health and wellness and education and wellness. And it's really about how much are we taking care of each other. So as we go through the session today, I really want you to think about how you're connecting to you and you first of all. When I work with teachers and leaders across the globe, because I am privileged enough to be able to do that, I work in multiple countries, I work on multiple international boards, and what I notice is the loneliness that we're all suffering from right now. But the privilege I have is thinking about how do we keep together and thinking about what's the most important thing. And I talk a lot about identity and knowing ourselves first. And as teachers and leaders, we sometimes have a dissonance inside ourselves that says to us, what is it that we can do to really do the right thing for kids when we're sometimes challenged with systems and processes that make us feel like we're not necessarily doing the right thing. So today I want to give you some tips and tricks for you, and my partner Beth, who's going to be doing my business partner Beth is going to be doing the work in the background. She's going to be writing some things down for you to have some ideas as we go. Now, I know I have an accent, so I'm hoping that you're going to be able to understand me. If not, and if I get excited, I'll start speaking too quickly. So please let me know if I'm going too fast and you're having trouble understanding me. So I want to talk about some questions for you today to think about, and I really challenge you to think about what's the most important thing for you and not to think about everybody else today. As a teacher, as an administrator, as a superintendent, I want to say, think about you first. I want you to think about understanding who you are. I want you to think about how you're connecting with the people in your world. I want you to think about how you're using your own learning to contribute for yourself and others. And I want you to think about how you're learning about what you're doing for you. And you might want to pop in the chat box, what are some of the things that are most important to you? And thinking about some of those questions, you might choose one of these questions that are along the side of the session. Oops, sorry, my hands are getting too excited. Along the side of the page today, what are some of those things that might be beneficial for you to think about over the summer when you take a break for you? And if you're feeling like you're going to be too busy to take a break, I suggest really quickly that the most important thing for you to do is think about making sure you take a break for you. One of the things that we can do is to put everybody else first, and that's the toughest thing of all. We've worked across Win the Learner First team about figuring out what's the most important things for understanding ourselves and to connect with our learning. Working across multiple countries, there are 4 outcomes that really seem to have made the biggest difference for us all. The first one is knowing ourselves, self-understanding. Who are we? How do we fit into the world? And how do we contribute what we have to humanity? The second one, which I'm going to focus a little bit more on today, is around connection. How do we connect with people and the world? But not just people in the world, it's about a whole range of other things. And we know from evidence and research, and we know that Dr. Lisa is going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more, but it's like, how do we make sure that we've got those connections? Because if we don't have the ways of living that are going to be really satisfying. Then what's the knowledge we really need to learn? Not the same knowledge as everybody else, because we're each different. And we know that when we give the same thing to children, they get bored, they get angry, they get dissatisfied, they get tired of doing the same things time and time again. So how do we figure out what is it that each child needs? Then we think about what are the competencies they need to really activate that knowledge and learn from that. So we'll talk a wee bit about that as we go through. Your personal values are the most important thing for you. And when they get challenged, your personal well-being is challenged. And then the well-being of others is challenged as well. So when we talk about ourselves, it's the importance of identifying who are we. And I talk about, can you know what your story is? It took me a long time to understand who I was and who I am and who I can be and who I can stand tall as being. I'm a Māori woman. I'm from New Zealand. I'm really proud of that. I work in education. I know what I can do. I know what I can say. And nobody can push me over because I can stand tall and say that. And I think some of us take time to really grow into ourselves because sometimes school didn't give us what we needed to be able to do that because we're so busy learning our content. I'm not knocking content because content's important, but so is learning about who we are. So some of the things I think are really important about our identity before we go into connection is thinking about, do you know your story? So when you meet someone, can you share who you are? Do you know what matters to you? Have you got what is really important? So when you're having your conversations and connecting, can you say, I know what matters to me? And do you know what you can contribute? Do you know what your gift is? Can you say, I can do this with my life and I'm contributing in a way that's really special and important to me? And do you have the courage to take action? When you see something that's important, are you able to take action with that? When you see something that's a challenge, can you take action with that? And I think these are the things that we're really trying to help all of our children to do, to notice things. And then the last one I think about is, do you have a pathway for success? Do you know how to help yourself to be successful? These are questions that we challenge each other with and ourselves with. So when I talked about those 4 outcomes, when we pull them all together, it's really about us, others, input, and output. So today, when you're thinking about you, acknowledging you as the priority in your life right here and right now today, it's self-understanding first. Being able to stand tall in your own skin, in your own identity, in your own family group, in your own relationship with you. Self-understanding is one of the most critical parts of being alive today. Then we can connect out with other people. So we talk about know yourself first. And so over the summer, we really want you to think about how can you remember who you are. And I talk a lot about remembering who you are because we're born with a lot of gifts and somehow we take those away from ourselves. So being able to stand tall and say, this is who I am. And then you plus. Who are some of the connections that you haven't had time to talk to? Who are some of those people that you want to reconnect with? So maybe family members, maybe community members, and maybe people that you want to be a part of. And then what's something you might want to learn about that you haven't had time to do, or even a book that you haven't picked up for a long time that would be really important to connect into and read about, some new knowledge, some learning that you want to undertake that you just haven't had time, some input into you, a hobby. I remember when I went to my doctor, and it was a regular doctor, a GP, and she asked me, Jojo, do you know what your life purpose is? Do you know what it is you want to learn about? And I looked at her and I said, you're not my naturopath. And she laughed her head off and she said, I don't have to be a naturopath to know that people are healthier and well when they know who they are and what their purpose is. And that really struck me as something that was kind of interesting. And I think Dr. Lisa will spend some time talking about that as well, is that knowing yourself and knowing who you are makes such a big difference. And then the competencies like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, those are what help you to be able to make those calls and really push out again and be able to do something with that. And when you have that confidence in yourself, they unlock your potential to be your best person. And this is for adults. This isn't just for our kids. And often we spend so much time thinking about just our kids that we don't take the time to think about who are we and what can we do for ourselves first. So in the work that we do, we create tools and we write these down. We describe what it looks like to be able to identify ourselves. Because what I've learned over time is that we make assumptions about what it looks like. Now, we can bring our own evidence to this because it's about ourselves, but sometimes it's hard for us to really understand what does it look like. So next time I come and talk with you, I'll share with you what does it look like in a learning progression. But to understand ourselves that way, we have to start thinking about evidence a little bit differently too. We can't do this in any standardized way. What we're looking for is how do we understand ourselves, and the people around us have to help us with that evidence. So therefore, we have to start connecting at a different level. We're not looking for are we perfect? We're looking for ways to understand how can I improve my own life and feel better about who I am? And sometimes our perception of ourselves is not necessarily the same as what others perceive us to be. And nearly every time I do this work, I find that people's perception of themselves is not necessarily as high as other people's perception is. So sometimes it's nice to get some feedback from other people. So when we're thinking about our identity, we're thinking about our place, where do we come from? What are our roots? Who are our people? What do our ancestors hold knowledge for us? In my background, where we come from, our mountain, our river, our people, that helps us know who we are. So a lot of you may have cultural identities that actually need to know that to help you to be who you are. Also for purpose, do we have a purpose in our life? Do we know what we want to learn? Do we know who we want to be? Do we understand ourselves enough? And then do we have the capacity to know where to go to get that information? Have we taught ourselves how to do that? And then we move into the connection. How do we then connect? And I'll spend a wee bit more time on this. And now Beth is going to write in there some really practical ideas on how to do some of these things. And she'll give you a really big list, but take note of the ones that really connect with you in your heart about how you can be your best person and live your best life over the summer. Because when you come back, we need you to be on your best, living your best life so the kids can see you as being a real human being and knowing that you love yourself enough to be able to love them too. So it's connecting with people we know and interact with. Do we know how to do that at a level that we enjoy? Not just the everyday stuff, but the actual enjoyment of being in a relationship with someone. And that doesn't mean just your partner, just your spouse, just your friends, just your people that you work with, but everybody that you connect with. Do we know how to do that? And my challenge in this one is to talk to them at a different level. Ask them who they are, not what they do. When you meet them somebody for the first time, who are you, rather than what do you do? Environmental, are you connecting with the natural environments that we have around us? Are you getting out into nature? Are you seeing the world in a different way for getting in touch in water, getting in touch in trees? In Japan, they have a process called tree bathing, where people pay to go and stand out and go walking in the forests to actually get access to trees. I think those are some interesting things to consider. Do you know how to connect? Are you helping to rebuild the natural environment around us? Conceptual. Are you connecting with what we learn and are learning? Do you know what you want to learn next? I think as teachers and leaders and superintendents, we often think that our learning is done, but we can keep learning for forever about stuff that we want to learn about, not stuff that we have to learn about. And I think that's the exciting part of being an adult, is we get to choose. And by choosing, we get to model what we're doing with our children. And then universal, I think connecting with all of humanity in the world. We know the world's a really tough place right now. We know that kids are seeing things that are different from what we saw when we were growing up. And I think what we want to show them is that we can connect to that and help discuss and show and share and not turn blind eyes to different things that are going on. How do we talk to each other and connect with each other in a way that helps connect us to what the reality of our world is? Wherever you may live, whatever situation you're in, how do we talk about it and connect with each other? So I think connection is bigger than just being a friend. Connection is bigger than just knowing each other. It's really quite a deep concept that we're really trying to help all of our children learn about. But to do that, we have to connect ourselves first and be open to who we are and be the best people we can be to live our very best lives that we want to live. So I think it's a really important time to understand ourselves, but to give yourselves time first, to learn about you again, to remind yourselves who you are, to take time. And even if that's just to sit, I always say that when I see people sitting there just doing nothing, that's actually doing something, because thinking is learning. Thinking is not doing nothing, it's actually learning at a particular point in time. What all this leads up to is contribution. Now, contribution is even smiling at somebody. We're sitting on a $35 trillion mental health bill by 2030 if we don't change what we do. And I know Gaggle and Dr. Lisa are doing a huge amount of work to try and change that. I'm doing a huge amount of work across the globe with multiple countries, really looking at how can we help each other connect to each other. And what we've developed with these 4 outcomes is called contributive learning, where we teach children that they are all special. We teach adults that they are all special, that if we find what we're good at, we can contribute to the world in our way every day. So I'm excited to be able to say that contribution means every one of us has something that we can give to the world. We've overprivileged certain professions for far too long. We now know that everybody has something they can contribute. And if we can find that in every child, we can find that in every adult, then we've got a hope for the world to be an amazing place to live in. And we know that it's the human factor that counts, And that's connection, social connection, real connection, living connection. And it's really exciting to be able to have that opportunity to talk about it, to have tools to help us to be able to do that in a way that's really positive and practical for us today in today's world. We have a whole system. I've written books. I wrote the tools for deep learning, led the tool development for deep learning, new pedagogies for deep learning. I've written a book on measuring human return. How do we measure all of this? There's a book from a child's perspective, depth file detectives. And we've got all of the evidence from across the globe. Schools around the world are working on this, but I always start with adults first. You are the most important people who are sitting in front of the children, and you are the ones who count the most to start with. So I'll stop about here, and then I'm going to pass it over to the wonderful Dr. Lisa, who's going to give a medical, psychological perspective on all of this, because that sort of gives us the whole answer to this, finishes the whole piece of the puzzle. Because when we bring academic learning together with social and emotional learning, we get a way to contribute to the world. It's possible to do it together. It's possible to measure it. It's possible to design for it. And it's possible when we weave it together, we have a great way of living, and we have a great way of learning and designing and being together in a world that we can create that enables everyone to have the life that they can lead and live their very best life. So I'll pass it over to you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to talk, and we'll have a chance to have some questions soon.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. You have so much good information, and as you do, I spend a lot of time with the educational world, and so it's so important, everything that you said. So I will probably piggyback on what Joanne was sharing in terms of the interpersonal environmental, conceptual, and obviously the universal, because that to me is, I love her work. And so if you haven't had a chance to look through it, it is an incredible approach. Obviously, from a clinical perspective, I have spent a ton of time working with teachers. I spent nearly 2 years during COVID offering my services for free for teachers, just trying to keep everybody's at a point where they could be stable. And now we're trying in this recovery phase. We've got a lot of teachers that have really significant emotional traumas based on the fact that they have children that they've lost that never came back after the pandemic. They've got constraints on them from an academic or administrative perspective because the kids have lost their progress. So one of the biggest areas that I see and what I think is really important is to know and understand what those differences are between sadness versus depression. And I think that a lot of times, we don't want to have a stigma wrapped around us, but there is definitely times in our lives when the weight of the world is more than we can handle. And so what Joanne was sharing about having the ability to recharge yourself is so important. And so if you are feeling that things are difficult or that you can't really get that energy or those things up, it's really important to go and talk to someone. Because I think that if we look at that kind of global sadness or that pressure that we're feeling, sometimes it can be a mild depression, and there are things that we can do. I love her suggestion about the environmental piece of going outside and grounding. There's a lot of science and research around just going outside and putting your feet to the ground and taking shoes off and really kind of just bending your world a little bit so that you're unplugged and not like having the pressure of everything. So hopefully summer will afford some of those times too. But if you need to go and talk to someone, definitely either a psychologist or your general practitioner are really equipped to like manage whether or not there's something that whether it's medication or counseling that could just help kind of bring you through and recharge you on that end. And then very closely related to depression, and a lot of people don't always recognize, but anxiety, they're kind of like kissing cousins. So when we talk about anxiety, it can be global, which we call generalized anxiety disorder, where it's like every day you're just kind of tightly wound and it's a very difficult like feeling and you're kind of stressed all the time. Or there can be just anxiety or panic disorder that we feel in these stress moments. So a lot of times if you, during your summer times or vacation breaks, that goes away, then it's really related to kind of the work that you're doing. And so uncovering a lot of that, and in psychology, that's what we do. If you have a counselor that you can work with, but talking through, okay, how do I manage or take and triage some of that information so that it's not making me fully anxious, and how do I have more power over that? And then the last area that I see a lot of is grief. And I think a lot of times the adults in the room think through grief as, we've lost someone in our life, but grief comes in a lot of different ways. And it comes from when you're in a caring environment where you're a teacher for a student, and you've got staff also that rely on you, and you have anything that happens to them, we can have a secondary grief process that occurs to us because we're consuming the other losses that are around us. So it isn't necessarily just a death or a divorce or a financial loss. It can be where we're absorbing the grief of that culture. And so when Jojo was talking about the universal and like this global connection that we're having and the state of the world, I think what I see in my practice a lot, and oftentimes with the teachers, is this consumed grief that they get from taking on with their compassion and empathy for the kids and their colleagues around them. So those are the three main areas that I would say that I would focus on, and just like identify whether or not you're struggling in that area, because I think that goes back to, if we can have that, what Jojo's point of having interpersonal relationship connections, that those can help in those. But we've got to, you've got to be able to talk through some of those things and find somebody that you can trust. And whether it's a person or a counselor or your general practitioner, they can be really, really supportive in those ways. Then I think the next slide we're going to go through is the social implications. And I just came back from a conference for Department of Education in Florida, which it was quite interesting to hear from a statewide perspective. But I had mental health professionals and safety officers and teachers in the room. The peer strain and educational strain that the adults are feeling. We can talk about it in kids' terms, but from an adult perspective, what we're seeing is our colleagues, that a lot of people have retired in the state of Florida specifically. They've had a turnover out of 67 counties, 61 of their superintendents have turned over in the last 4 years. So you can imagine the massive shift that occurs administratively. That's just one example. So I'm sure in your home district, there's a lot of changes that are occurring with teachers retiring and just not able to do that. And so it puts strain on us that are staying behind and that are trying to actually accommodate and pick up slack and help new teachers or new people that are coming into our system. So it's really, really important to understand from that social perspective. And again, that goes back to Jojo's point about interpersonal and having really strong connections in that space. I think that we sometimes forget about that. And I think there was a submitted question about what do we do on if we have constraints on our end. It's figuring out in the break room or via your emails and figuring out whether or not you can get 15 minutes or even 20 minutes with a friend, or maybe you have a break in between for a lunch period and you have that ability, or you can go to your administrators and say, we could use a 30-minute kind of download to have everyone in the fourth grade, all the teachers from fourth grade or all of the elementary school, figure out whether or not push against that kind of constraint and figure out if you can pull in some support under that, because I think colleagues are one of our biggest strengths if we can figure out how to manage it. Then obviously family stress. Family stress is another one that I think that when we're talking about when the adults that are coming into the room, a lot of times children don't see teachers as people, they see them as teachers, and the administrators see them as their colleagues and their employees in order for them to be able to show up and do their job every day. But that doesn't make you immune to the family stresses that we all have on our own side and what goes on through that. So I think that what I've seen over the last probably 5 to 10 years is that there's an increased level of family stress that happens. Obviously my background in working with technology and social media and how that's changed and morphed the family dynamic. We don't seem to have that authenticity of connection, even with our own families, because we've got our devices and we have this ability to be so much more productive, people would say. But it does cause stress and it does cause a strain on our family, and that comes into the system. So if you can take a minute to kind of like recapture and I think at the end, anybody can reach out to me, as JoJo's offering as well. But like that family piece is so important because it is really where we leave our work and we go home. And so how do we create a safe and supportive environment in our family that can be very helpful? And then the educational struggles that I see oftentimes is that you keep having more and more demands put upon you in terms of professional development hours and new standards, and particularly with the global approach now, that there's a lot of different groups and factions that are kind of coming to collision on what we're teaching our kids or what books that they're reading. And there's all of these like massive stresses in the educational world in terms of how do we just connect and teach our kids. And when we're coming in and there's like kind of this political social agenda that's like really influencing and making teachers afraid to be those educators, it breaks my heart, because obviously education leaders don't go into it for the fame or the glory or the money. They go into it because they're compassionate and they have this empathy and love for children and education. So I just wanted to recognize that I know that that's a huge social implication. And so how you figure out a way to kind of isolate yourself from that kind of political, social influence and really lean back into the administrators in your world and say, listen, I just need to teach, and I don't need this to be on my plate, because I think a lot of times I see that coming down and going into the teacher's lap specifically. And it really should be something that's managed at the district level or on the board level. And the teacher should be protected in that. So again, if that's something over the summer, you get some of your educators together and say, listen, this is how we could be protected more, or this is what the support that we need. I think that could be really important for everyone and give you a lot of support moving into the next year. And then I have one more slide, is the behavioral signs. And this is really just an acknowledgement of where I see kind of the global vision of like where education is. I just got back from a trip over to the UK. I went into England and went into Wales and then went to Italy. I met with a ton of people abroad. And I can tell you right now that this is definitely a global issue. And so to JoJo's point of this universal approach that we need to all understand. But what we're seeing is a huge level of the students and the academic and parents being very disrespectful to our educators. I'm sure that if anybody wanted to put in the chat, I'm sure that everybody has a story on that. But it started at this point. I feel like that there was like this tipping point when COVID occurred and everybody was really angry and frustrated in the home world, and they were leaning into these teachers, which were doing the best that they very could. But that disrespect has continued. What I've seen is snowballing. And so as a leader and as an educator, it's recognizing that somebody else's issue. And so if it's a student or if it's a parent, or in fact, even if it's an administrator or a colleague, that disrespect isn't something that you need to absorb or take for yourself. It's drawing a very clear line and saying, all right, behaviorally, if there's somebody that's being disrespectful and they're being, it's making me uncomfortable, it's being able to say, hey, acknowledge that. I can see that you're really uncomfortable and that you're feeling uncomfortable. It feels very disrespectful to me. Can we talk through this together? And sometimes just having that conversation and checking somebody can give you and empower you the ability to draw that boundary better with those people. And also just kind of understand, am I just taking what people are giving me, or do I actually have the ability to have a conversation about it? And then the next one that I see a lot of when I work with my schools is this hopelessness and feeling hopeless that the system is going in the wrong direction versus feeling more empowered in order to take control over that. So what I hear a lot of times in education is teachers or administrators talking about, it is what it is. Instead of saying, it is what I make it. And so I just feel like if we can recognize it's okay to have those moments of being overwhelmed and feeling like, man, this might be too much for me to handle, but have that moment and then shift in and get into the tools. Like JoJo's tools are really incredible. Get a group of other teachers that might want to do just like a summer support group where, maybe it's like getting together over coffee or wine or something and go through some of those materials and really figuring out, okay, how do we embolden ourselves and how do we figure out a way? Because it's going to be a continued stress upon the educational world as this shift occurs, particularly as we're shifting into kind of these AI metaverse worlds. Education is changing more rapidly than we've ever seen before. And so that part of it is going to be difficult to like manage. But again, like I'd say, like, if I can say, if you start to feel those feelings, like figure out ways. And again, like I'm happy to be a resource. I know JoJo is that we figure out ways to get support around that, either through administration, through colleagues, or even asking for PD that really supports you in that emotional place personally and that well-being. And then finally, the recklessness. A lot of times when we get overwhelmed, and this isn't specific to educators, but we start to make more reckless decisions in our own personal lives. And I've seen that a lot in my practice where we'll lean into substances or we'll lean into, even on social media, writing things that can get us into trouble. It's having that impulsivity, or I call it recklessness, because I think we tend to get overwhelmed. And so we're trying to self-soothe and heal. And instead of going into some of those points and those decisions where we're feeling reckless, or we're doing things that are maybe reckless, or putting our relationships or our jobs at risk, it's really pulling back and saying, all right, what am I doing here? And how do I help myself? And really also, if you see colleagues like shifting behaviorally in places that you're not used to, and is uncharacteristic for them, it's the same thing when I talk to my kiddos. When I'm going out to schools, it's like, if you see something, you should say something. How do we empathetically approach someone and help them if we see those things happening with someone else? Because certainly we would want somebody to show that same concern and compassion for ourselves. So that goes back to JoJo's interpersonal and conceptual place, because we've got to learn how to be more empathetically curious into what's going on around us so that we can respond and support those people. So those are kind of the psychology and the clinical aspects of what we're seeing. And again, like, I'm really interested in hearing how everybody is doing on there, but I think that's it on my slides. So I will hand it back over.
Dr. Lisa, JoJo, thank you so much for your continued commitment and contributions to this clearly very important work. We have just a few minutes left, and we've had some questions come through, so I'd like to see if we can take some time to cover those. The first one I have here is, as a reading coach, I witness on a daily basis the burnout that my teachers feel because of structural constraints beyond their control. Any additional advice to support them would be greatly appreciated. So I'm not sure who would like to take that first. Dr. Sherman?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm JoJo. This is like really kind of what you talked to, but I absolutely think that from a burnout perspective, like, I think that what we're doing is we're accepting the fact that because our jobs are hard, and because the fact that we're putting too much more and more on our plates, and that we show up for the kids, we forget about ourselves. So I think that from that standpoint of that structural constraint, whether it's the time that you have on campus or not on campus, it's figuring out ways where you like slow yourself down and say, all right, am I getting the support from my administrators or from my colleagues that I need? And are there, even if it's 10 minutes or 15 minutes where I can get some support, where I am able to, journal out, even if it's like through kind of like a shared Google Doc in a school system between the teachers, or if it's something that where we're connecting online with one another in like a private group online, using technology as a tool and not as a toy in that sense, and like supporting each other. Because I think burnout really occurs when we're not taking that minute. And what Jojo was talking about is like really doing the self-care for ourselves. Jojo, if you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Lee. So I think it's really important to do all of those things. And I think I would also add that a lot of the times we go into schools and when we're doing the support around them, we look at all of the different things that schools are still doing that they don't need to do. I think a lot of the time there's been layer upon layer of different superintendents coming in, different sort of structures or different governors coming into each of the different states, and there's been different rules and different policies. And what has happened is that people have still been hanging on to different things that they've had to do over periods of time. And sometimes it's time to do a bit of a clean out and actually think, what are the things that we still actually have to do? What are the things that are still relevant in today's world? And given that we do have access to new technology, what can that technology help us do? So sometimes it's time to step back and do that reflection and say, what's still relevant for us right now? And sometimes it does take a little bit of extra work to do that. But the refreshing part of that is that you can start to throw away some things that no longer are relevant for us in today's world. And that's a really big piece of it. And I think part of it, when you start to do a different way of teaching and learning, when we're thinking about who are we now as people and what do our children need right now, it's quite a different way of teaching and learning. So it's you're starting to get into that proactive stance of thinking about, what does this child need? What do I need? And it really shifts the needle for that burnout phase. You start to actually really start to enjoy your job again. You start to beat the system almost, because you're actually recreating the system as you're going along. And when you have a good set of tools behind you, it actually starts to become quite a joyous job again. And, I've been accosted in ladies' rooms and things like that, where people are saying, I actually enjoy my job again after, 20 years of hating it. So it's like starting to think about what are the ways we can start to, turn back towards what are we here for and why do we do this?
I love that. Another question that came in here is, how do we as adults track our personal growth and progress on the dimensions of connection? And I think, Jojo, this one is directed at you.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. We've written learning progressions that are not for self-understanding, for connection, and for competency. We haven't written them for knowledge because that's curriculum, and that's up to what each place, country, each state wants to have for their knowledge base. What we've done them for, they're not age bound. They're not stage or age bound. And the reason for that is that because sometimes when I'm learning something new that's challenging me in my knowledge about myself, I might be right back as a beginner. And I might be right at the top end when I'm really confident in some particular area. So the thing why we did it that way is that we ebb and flow as human beings. We're not linear in our learning. I've never met anybody who learns anything exactly the same way as anybody else. And I think we come and go with our knowledge base and our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of how to connect with each other, and the complexity of that shifts. So we have a set of tools that helps us to keep on track, and each set of tools starts with that kind of basis of understanding ourselves, how we fit into the world, and then that really big call to action of how can we contribute back to our world, our planet, and to prosperity too, because we do need to be thinking about how can we be continue to keep the world moving as well. So I think adults need that way of thinking about themselves as well. And again, as I said, the evidence for those ways of knowing ourselves and connecting, that shifts our way of understanding what assessment and measurement looks like too, because we're now starting to broaden our picture of what success looks like for us as an adult and what success looks like for children too.
There's another question here. What are some suggestions for ways to incorporate these ideas into my school culture and with my staff?
You want me to go, or Lisa, do you?
Yeah,
Dr.
go ahead, Jojo. Yeah.
We have long lists of different ideas that we've gathered from different schools that we've worked with from different countries, and we can share some of those. Beth has put a lot of those into the webinar chat, which they can be pulled into a list. There are also tons of them on our website and our books. But I think the most important thing is ask the kids too. They actually will tell you some of the ways they want to do this, connecting and contributing. Some of the things that we've seen have been so enormous, because it's actually the school walls almost come down, because you're actually starting to move into the community and reconnect with each other and solve problems. I set up a charitable trust in New Zealand, and it's the concept of it is to try and solve world problems through education. But we actually solve climate change through, and we educate ourselves as we go. So the concept is not to sort of worry so much about the education piece, because we're learning as we're doing it, and that shifts how we educate our kids. So it's sort of it's a different way of thinking about education, and it's actually very engaging because we're not so worried about that piece of it. So I think the more we start to connect with each other and go out and find a problem together, go and solve it together. One of the examples is we had a group of children who were in this sort of, I think it's equivalent to grades 7 and 8. They were worried that their parents were getting really overweight. And so, because they had to go on the train every day to work and back, and they didn't have enough time to do their exercise. So they worked with the city council to get a carriage on the train to have exercise equipment in it. So they had to figure out, which was the equipment that would be able to be worked on a train, which was the equipment that, wouldn't get stolen, which was the equipment that wouldn't sort of, like when you're moving along the train, that it wouldn't sort of fall over you when you're doing your weightlifting and things like that. And they did it. So you can imagine what sort of complexity of thinking and writing and measuring and math and science and all of those things went into that learning. So those and the collaboration and the connection that they all had to have for that. So it's exciting things like that can happen in learning and in the real world learning that really starts to shift how we think about teaching and understanding each other. So those are the sorts of things that start that universal connections, that interpersonal connection, all of those things, the environmental connection, bringing it all together and being excited about learning and caring about each other again.
What a great example. That's a great example. I heard someone say, instead of asking a child, what do they want to be? Ask them, what do they want to solve? Like, what problem do they want to solve when they grow up? So that plugs right into that. That's fantastic. We have another question here, and that is, what can I do to check in on my own well-being during the school year? And I think, Jojo, that one is for you as well.
If you're checking in on your own well-being through the year, it's a matter of what I teach people to do is become very evaluative in their thinking about not just the children but themselves. So when you start using sets of tools like we have, where you're sort of looking at your own progression of learning and understanding, you start to think differently about what you're doing and how you're understanding yourself. So you put yourself into the same category as you do watching children. You're looking for evidences. And as Dr. Lisa said, you need to know if you're starting to go down a track that is actually taking you into depression, or that you are actually getting, the level of anxiety is getting too much. And it's actually just by monitoring and seeing yourself, because I think assessment and measurement is the most exciting field to be in, because it's not scary. It actually helps you live your best life. And if you don't know who you are, you can't actually keep an eye on yourself. So for me, it's like really understanding who you are. You've actually then can check in. So when you're doing your sort of check-ins with the kids, you're doing it with yourself as well. You're sort of noticing, where am I at on my progression of understanding who I am? Am I starting to go down? Like, so many people don't realize they're depressed or anxious until it's too late, and they right in the depth of despair. And I think the work that Dr. Lisa is talking about is that let's catch it before we're too far down that track. My work is to try and get it so that we don't ever have to get there. But once we're there, it's too late to sort of, it's not too late, but it's like, that's when we need the medication and the real deep work to sort of get ourselves back. I want to be at the top of the cliff before we fall over. So we have the tools and the mechanisms to ensure that we don't. So it's being really evaluative and being honest to ourselves, being really brave and courageous and honest about who we are and what's really going on in our life. So I think being an evaluative way, having an evaluative way of thinking and being honest.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa. Did you want to weigh in on that as well?
I would, the sentiment that JoJo just said is very true. The earlier we can have the signs, the best. One of the things that I share often is having someone, even it's like the reading buddies, right? Like if you have a colleague or you have a spouse or a partner or a family member, but having somebody that you check in with that really can give you honest, I guess a reference for whether or not they see a difference in you. Because sometimes because it's ourselves, we don't see those shifts because it's the little tiny shifts that happen over a day to day to day. And so it just feels kind of like nothing's changing for us. But from the outside, if somebody hasn't seen us for a while, or they're checking in with us like on a weekly or monthly basis, they really can see a bigger change in us. So it's just having somebody that you're kind of accountable to, and knowing that you can be there for them. And one of the groups I went and spoke to, I got a feedback from some of the teachers, and they started actually an emoji system. So the teachers would send each other emojis of like how they were feeling on a certain day. And they were having a lot of fun with that. Like, if it was a heart or a sunshine, or, if it was a rain cloud, like that was a harder day. And that would give them kind of the key and the cues to like maybe check in a little bit further. So there's ways that we can do this, like in order to make sure that we're not just for ourselves paying attention to it, but also have somebody else that we're kind of accountable to. And that can be very helpful.
Thank you so much. So the one other thing that kind of came up in the chat was whether or not there will be a recording of this webinar sent out. And the answer to that is yes. We will be sending a recording of the webinar after the session so that you can access all of those wonderful resources that have been sent out by Beth within the chats there. And speaking of resources, if we can advance to the next slide, I can show you, we've got some resources listed here. So in that recording, you'll have access to these links here, both from the Learner First books and papers that take a closer look at the contributive learning, and then some case studies there. And then there is a self-care checklist from Gaggle, as well as some student support resources, and a link to the Student Wellness Webinar series. So I guess the next question is, how do we extend this great work to our students? So if you all have enjoyed this content today, you'll want to join us for our fall webinar, where we'll explore how to apply these same strategies and principles in the classroom to benefit students. Just in time for back to school. So keep an eye in your inbox, as well as on our social media channels for a registration announcement in the next couple of months. This has been such a great hour with you all. Thank you each for taking the time to be with us today. Be well, everyone.